My name is Gerald Keene. I am 81 years old, and I live in the same yellow brick house in Tallahassee that my wife and I bought 56 years ago, when the grass was still thick and green, and the oaks behind the porch hummed with cicadas in the summer heat. Now the trees are dying, one branch at a time, and the grass has thinned out like my hair, patchy, gray, too stubborn to let go. I retired from teaching American history 20 years ago, and since then my days have folded into one another like pages of a book that no one opens anymore. Every morning I make oatmeal on the same gas stove we bought in 1973, open the window above the sink, and listen to the distant traffic on Monroe Street. Some mornings I forget that she, Margaret, has been gone for almost 7 years, and I catch myself setting out 2 cups of coffee. I stand there, holding the spoon, feeling the absurdity of it, and yet I still cannot bring myself to put the second cup back in the cabinet. I keep it there, on the counter, as if she might come back just to scold me for putting too much sugar in mine again. I have one daughter, Marion, 51, who lives 40 minutes away, though it might as well be another state. She works as a financial advisor in Jacksonville now, remarried after her first husband died in a boating accident. Her voice on the phone has become that flat, polished tone people develop when they spend too many years convincing others they're in control. She calls once every few weeks, usually while driving, and the conversations always sound like a courtesy call more than a wish to talk. "How are you feeling, Dad? Are you eating properly? Did you pay that property tax yet?" The questions come like a checklist, and I give short answers so she can get back to her world. Sometimes I want to tell her about my dreams, how Margaret still appears in them, wearing her old summer hat and calling me to the porch. But Marion would only sigh and say, "You need to get out more, Dad. Maybe join a senior group." The truth is, I stopped trying to tell her about my inner life years ago, when I realized that everything I said made her uncomfortable, as if she feared my vulnerability might one day become her responsibility. After Margaret died, Marion handled most of the paperwork: insurance, mortgage, utility accounts. She said she was helping me simplify, though I sometimes wondered who was really simplifying whose life. She insisted I give her medical power of attorney. "Just in case, Dad, if anything happens." At the time, it seemed harmless. She was my daughter, my only family. What harm could there be in letting her sign a few hospital forms on my behalf? I remember her sliding the documents across the kitchen table with that brisk efficiency she inherited from her mother. I signed them without reading too closely, my eyes tired, my heart still raw from grief. She kissed my forehead, told me I'd done the right thing, and drove away before I could ask what exactly I'd just agreed to. The years since then have been quiet, but not peaceful. I try to keep a routine, because a man without rhythm begins to dissolve. I feed the stray cat that comes to my porch every evening. I trim the hedges when my knees allow. On Sundays, I sit on the porch swing with the local paper and a cup of weak coffee, pretending to read while I listen to the neighborhood kids shriek in their yards. Sometimes the mail brings postcards from the world I used to be part of, a former student who became a lawyer in Atlanta, another who teaches in Texas, each writing to thank me for inspiring their love of history. I keep those cards in a shoebox in the hall closet next to Margaret's wedding shoes. I tell myself that if anyone ever asks what my life amounted to, I can show them that box. It's proof that I once mattered. Still, there's a certain ache that comes with old age, one that painkillers and nostalgia can't touch. It's not in the bones or the lungs, but somewhere behind the ribs, where memory sits like a patient stone. Nights are the worst. I turn off the television at 10, but sleep doesn't come until after 1. I lie in the half-dark, listening to the refrigerator hum, counting Margaret's breaths that are no longer there. I keep her photograph on the nightstand, the one taken on our trip to Savannah, where she's laughing with the wind in her hair. Every morning I greet her. Every night I tell her good night. Sometimes I imagine she answers. That kind of loneliness doesn't scream. It whispers and lingers. Marion stopped visiting regularly after my hip surgery 3 years ago. She came once, stayed less than an hour, and spent most of it taking phone calls on her Bluetooth headset. "You really should move to assisted living, Dad," she said, without looking up from her phone. "It's safer there. You'll have nurses on call, social events, everything you need." I said I preferred to die in my own bed, and she rolled her eyes the way she used to as a teenager. "Don't be dramatic. Nobody's talking about dying." But I was, not in fear, but in preparation. I have lived long enough to know that death, like taxes, doesn't wait for your consent. What unsettled me was the sense that Marion had already begun to imagine my absence. Once, when she thought I wasn't listening, she told a realtor friend over the phone that Dad's property has good resale potential once he's ready to transition. Transition? That's what they call dying now. Euphemisms are the polite armor of those who don't want to feel. I didn't confront her about it. I just stopped inviting her to visit. If she came, fine. If she didn't, even better. My world had shrunk to the size of this house, and within it I could at least control the silence. Yet, as the body weakens, even silence becomes treacherous. I began to feel a dull, persistent ache in my abdomen last spring. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough to remind me that something inside was losing patience. My doctor prescribed mild medication and said it was probably digestive, but I knew that tone, professional vagueness that means we'll deal with it when it gets worse. And it did. By late summer, I could barely stand upright for long. I told Marion once in passing that I was having trouble eating. She promised to schedule an appointment with a specialist, but forgot. I ended up arranging it myself. There was a time when she would have rushed over with soup and blankets. Now she sends text messages. "Did you take your meds? Need me to call the pharmacy?" It's strange how affection can turn into project management. Still, I can't entirely blame her. The world moves differently for her generation. Quicker, more transactional. I represent everything she's trying not to become. Slow, uncertain, irrelevant. I sometimes catch a glimpse of that fear in her eyes, the same way people look at gravestones, with a mix of pity and horror. Perhaps she believes that by keeping her distance, she's protecting herself from the contagion of aging. I have learned not to expect tenderness. It's a dangerous craving for those of us who outlive the people who truly loved us. Instead, I cling to small rituals. Every Thursday, I drive to the farmer's market, park in the same spot, and buy 2 peaches, even though I can only eat 1. I bring the other home and leave it on Margaret's side of the table until it starts to wrinkle, then throw it away. It's foolish, but it gives me the illusion of continuity. Life at this age is mostly about illusions that keep you from crumbling under the weight of reality. When the pain in my abdomen became unbearable, I tried not to think of hospitals. I've seen too many old men go in and never come out. Still, I packed a small bag, just in case, and left it by the door. It had my identification, insurance card, and a folded letter Margaret wrote years ago in which she told me, "Don't let anyone decide for you how you should leave this world." I didn't know how prophetic those words would become. I read that letter sometimes when I feel the air thinning around me, when I sense that the people closest to me no longer see me as a person, but as a liability waiting for resolution. Marion called one Friday evening, her voice rushed as usual. "Dad, I've got a meeting Monday, but I'll try to swing by next weekend. Are you doing okay?" I said yes, though my stomach felt like a knot of burning wires. "Good," she replied. "Just don't overdo it. And remember, if anything happens, the hospital has my number." She said it as if reassuring herself. After she hung up, I sat in the kitchen staring at the phone, wondering if she would really answer if that call ever came. Sometimes I imagine Margaret sitting across from me, her hands folded, listening to all this with that half-smile of quiet disapproval. She'd say, "You always give people too much credit, Gerald." Maybe she's right. Maybe I've been mistaking politeness for love, efficiency for care. When you grow old, you start reinterpreting your entire life, and what you discover isn't always kind. The night before everything changed, I couldn't sleep. The pain pulsed like a heartbeat inside my stomach. But what kept me awake was not the pain itself. It was fear. Not of dying, but of dying in someone else's hands, in a room where your wishes are ignored because your voice is too weak to matter. So I wrote a note on the back of an old utility bill. "In any emergency, I want full resuscitation and all life-saving measures. Signed, Gerald Keene." I folded it and placed it in my wallet. I didn't think it would ever matter. I only did it to calm myself down. But deep down, a quiet dread whispered that I might need that piece of paper sooner than I thought. The next morning, as the Florida sun rose sharp and indifferent over the cracked driveway, I bent down to feed the stray cat and felt a sudden tearing pain inside me, so fierce that I dropped the bowl and fell to my knees. The cat hissed and ran off. The last thing I remember before the darkness folded over me was the smell of spilled milk and the dull thud of my body hitting the kitchen floor. When I woke up, I thought I was still in my kitchen, lying on the cold tile, because the light above me was a sterile white glare that hurt my eyes, and the smell was the same mixture of antiseptic and loneliness that hospitals always carry. I tried to move, but my body felt like it had been drained and filled again with something heavier than blood. I heard a rhythmic beeping somewhere close by, and then a woman's voice, soft but urgent, saying, "Mr. Keene, can you hear me?" I wanted to answer, but my tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. She said something else, her tone turning sharper, and I realized there were more people in the room. I heard the metallic click of instruments, the shuffle of shoes, the controlled chaos of people who live on the edge of emergencies. For a moment, I thought this might be the end. And what surprised me most was how calm I felt. I remember thinking, so this is it. At least it's happening quickly. But then, through the fog, I remembered the note in my wallet, the one I had written less than a day ago. And I tried to speak, to tell them not to let me go, to keep me here no matter what it took. The next thing I knew, I was awake again. But this time the room was silent except for the hum of a machine pumping oxygen. My throat felt raw, and when I tried to swallow, pain sliced through my abdomen like a blade. I realized I had been through surgery. A curtain moved, and a woman in a blue scrub cap appeared, looking surprised to see my eyes open. "Well, you made it through, Mr. Keene," she said, with a smile that carried something more than professional relief. "We were worried for a while." I managed to whisper, "What happened?" She hesitated. "You had a perforated ulcer. It was bad, but the surgeons fixed it. You're lucky." Her voice trailed off as she adjusted the IV line. There was a pause, too long to be casual, before she added quietly, "Your daughter's been here." I tried to form her name, but only a rasp came out. The nurse lowered her voice further. "She gave the doctor's instructions before your surgery. She said you had a do not resuscitate order. But I double-checked your file and didn't find one. Then I found a note in your wallet." She met my eyes. "That's the only reason they revived you when your heart stopped on the table." For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. My heart had stopped. They had revived me, and Marion had told them not to. I wanted to ask if she might have misunderstood, if there was some bureaucratic confusion, but the nurse's expression told me everything. It wasn't confusion. It was intention. "She told the surgeon that you wouldn't want to live on machines," the nurse continued softly, glancing toward the hallway as if afraid someone might overhear. "But when I saw your note, I made sure they followed that instead. I hope you don't mind. I kept it with your file for proof." I tried to thank her, but the words dissolved into a hoarse whisper. She squeezed my hand gently, as if understanding everything I couldn't say. "Rest now," she said. "You're safe." But I didn't feel safe. I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Margaret died. Cold, unmoored disbelief. I tried to imagine Marion standing outside the operating room, telling strangers to let me die. The image didn't fit the daughter I once carried on my shoulders through the 4th of July parade, the girl who used to cry when I left for work. Yet I couldn't deny what the nurse had said. When she left the room, I stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing the cracks like a map, and tried to make sense of the betrayal. Perhaps she thought it was mercy. Perhaps she believed I was suffering. But no, that wasn't it. She hadn't been there when I collapsed. She hadn't seen the ambulance, hadn't heard the doctor say anything about my condition. The only way she could have known I was dying was if someone called her from the hospital, and even then, she'd had no reason to give such an order so quickly. I drifted in and out of sleep for what must have been a day or two. Time in hospitals melts into an unbroken glare of light and sound. Every time I opened my eyes, a new nurse was checking my vitals, changing a bag, or murmuring something about my recovery. I asked for the one who had spoken to me about the DNR, but no one seemed to know who I meant. Maybe she was off shift, or maybe she wasn't supposed to have told me anything. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing in a fevered haze, until, one afternoon, a young man in a white coat, Dr. Vasquez, came to check on me. He looked like he'd barely left college, though his eyes were already tired. "You're doing well, Mr. Keene," he said. "We were close there for a while. Your daughter was very clear about not wanting any heroic measures." I froze. Hearing it confirmed by someone else was like being struck with a second knife. "I didn't say that," I whispered. He smiled with that condescending patience people use with old men. "Of course. But sometimes our loved ones know what we'd want better than we do ourselves." I wanted to laugh, but it hurt too much. "I wrote it down," I managed to say, each word scraping my throat. "In my wallet. I said I wanted everything done." He frowned, uncertain. "That's not what your daughter told us." "Then your notes are wrong," I croaked. "Check them." He didn't respond. He just patted my hand awkwardly and said, "Try to rest. Stress isn't good for your heart." And then he was gone, leaving me staring at the door, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. That night, the same nurse returned, the one who had defied the order. Her badge read, Lydia R. She looked uneasy, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to keep. She glanced around to make sure we were alone. "Mr. Keene," she said in a low voice, "I probably shouldn't say this, but I think you need to know. After the surgery, while you were still in recovery, your daughter came to the nurse's station. She asked if you were still with us. When I told her you were stable, she said, "Why is he still alive?" Lydia hesitated, studying my face. I recorded it on my phone. It's against protocol, but I thought, if something ever happened, it might matter. My chest tightened, and not from the incision. "She said those exact words?" I asked. Lydia nodded solemnly. "Yes, I'm sorry." She slipped a small slip of paper onto my bedside table. "That's my number. If you ever need me to confirm what happened, I will." After she left, I stared at that piece of paper for a long time, unable to process what it meant. I thought of the power of attorney I had signed, the trust I had placed in Marion, and how easily she had used that power to decide my fate. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me. I wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, but my phone was nowhere to be seen. Hospitals take away your personal things, as if to remind you that your life no longer belongs to you. I asked a nurse the next morning if I could speak to my daughter. "She went home yesterday," the nurse said. "Said she had business to attend to, but she'd check in later." There was no later. Days passed, and no one came. When you're old, people assume your emotions are fragile. The truth might kill you faster than disease. But silence is worse. Silence kills in slower ways. Each day I grew stronger physically, yet the thought of that conversation outside the operating room gnawed at me. Why was she in such a hurry to let me go? Did she really believe my life was no longer worth living? Or was there something else behind it? Something colder? I began to recall fragments of our last few interactions, the way she had insisted on handling my finances, the questions about my house deed, the subtle pressure to move into assisted living. It all began to connect in an ugly pattern. Maybe she didn't want mercy. Maybe she wanted closure of another kind. On the 5th day, a hospital social worker came to my room with papers for me to sign. Post-operative care, insurance confirmation, and a review of my advanced directives. The words felt sinister now. I read every line carefully, my hands shaking. At the bottom of one form, in faint blue ink, there was a checked box next to "Do Not Resuscitate." My signature was forged beneath it. The handwriting was a poor imitation, but unmistakably an attempt to pass as mine. I looked up at the social worker and asked where this came from. She said it had been faxed from my daughter's office the morning of my surgery. "But she said you both discussed it," the woman added gently. "We didn't," I said, my voice breaking. "We never did." The woman's polite smile faltered, replaced by a look of discomfort that said she'd seen this kind of thing before and didn't want to get involved. She gathered the papers and left, mumbling something about checking with administration. That night, I barely slept. I replayed Lydia's words in my mind, the recorded sentence echoing like a curse. Why is he still alive? It became a rhythm inside my head, matching the pulse of the heart she didn't want revived. I realized that surviving the surgery wasn't the end of my ordeal. It was only the beginning. Whatever Marion had set in motion, she would not give up easily. And now I knew, with the clarity that only betrayal can bring, that I had to protect myself. Not from illness, from my own blood. The next morning, when the attending physician came in to check my chart, I asked for a copy of all my records and demanded that my daughter's medical power of attorney be revoked. He looked surprised, but something in my eyes must have told him I wasn't senile. He nodded slowly and said, "We'll see what we can do." As he left, I felt the first tremor of resolve returning to me. I had been brought back from the brink of death by a stranger's courage, and I owed it to that act of mercy not to fade quietly. I would recover. I would go home. And I would find out just how far my daughter had already gone to erase me. When I was discharged from the hospital, the sky outside was the color of pewter, heavy and unwelcoming, and for a moment I wondered if I had been released too soon, if the world outside was any safer than the one I had just escaped. The orderly wheeled me out to the entrance, and when I asked about my daughter, he said she had called earlier, but didn't leave a message. No one came to pick me up, so I called a cab with the few dollars left in my wallet. The driver, a man with kind eyes, helped me into the back seat and didn't speak during the whole ride. When we reached my house, I paid him and stood on the driveway, staring at the yellow bricks that had once meant security. The windows were shuttered, and the air smelled faintly of mold and stale air. I fumbled with my keys, entered, and found that the answering machine's light was blinking. There were 3 messages, all from Marion. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, and strangely cheerful. "Dad, I hope you're resting. I'm taking care of few administrative things for you, just bills and insurance updates. Don't worry, everything's under control." The second message: "The hospital sent me some paperwork to finalize, so I stopped by your bank to confirm your signature. They'll probably call you, just routine." And the third, her tone sharper, more impatient: "You need to stop worrying, Dad. I know what I'm doing. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Something in those words chilled me more than the air-conditioned sterility of the hospital ever had. I knew that tone. It was the same she used when she was a teenager, lying about where she'd been, certain that I wouldn't check. I sat at the kitchen table, the one Margaret and I had varnished together decades ago, and stared at the messages until their false warmth turned bitter in my ears. The house felt unfamiliar now, as if someone else had been living there while I was gone. I checked the drawers and the desk. Some of my documents had been moved: bank statements, insurance forms, even the folder containing the deed to the house. My passport was gone. It didn't take a detective to understand what that meant. The next morning I went to my local bank branch, an old limestone building with brass railings and the faint smell of paper and disinfectant. The same teller who had helped me for years smiled politely, but when she looked up my account, her expression changed. "Mr. Keene," she said carefully, "I see here that your daughter recently updated your account access. She said you authorized her to make transactions on your behalf while you were in the hospital." I felt my pulse rise. "I did not," I said, perhaps louder than necessary. The teller, flustered, asked if I'd like to speak to the branch manager. Within minutes, a middle-aged woman in a navy suit appeared, guiding me into her office. "Mr. Keene," she said gently, "I understand your concern. We did receive a signed authorization form with your name on it." She slid the paper across the desk. I looked down at the forged signature, my name bent and trembling in a way that only someone imitating age would write. My hand, even weak, had never looked like that. "That's not mine," I said flatly. She frowned. "Then I suggest we freeze all linked accounts until this is clarified. Would you like us to do that?" I nodded. "Immediately," I said. As she typed, I felt both humiliated and strangely alive. Betrayal, I realized, had a way of sharpening the senses. Every word, every sound, every movement around me became painfully distinct, as though the world itself had decided to stop pretending. The manager handed me a printout. "There was a withdrawal 2 days ago," she said. $10,000 from your savings, transferred to an account under Marion R. Hollis. My daughter's new married name. "Would you like to dispute the transaction?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "and I'd like a full record of everything she touched." Walking home took longer than usual. The August heat pressed on my chest, and my stitches pulled with every step. But I refused to take the bus. I needed the pain. It kept my mind sharp. When I reached my porch, there was an envelope taped to the front door. Marion's handwriting. "Dad, don't panic. I had to take care of a few financial matters urgently. I'll explain everything later. Please don't make this messy. Love, M." There was no phone number, no return address, just that patronizing "Love, M" that tasted like mockery. Inside the house, I went straight to the study and locked the door. On the desk, beneath a pile of old mail, I found the folder with my living will and medical directives. The same power of attorney papers I'd signed years ago stared back at me like evidence in a trial. I read them this time, every line, and there it was in small, cruel print. In the event that the principal is deemed mentally or physically incapacitated, the designated agent has full authority to act in all legal and financial matters, including medical decisions. It meant that if Marion convinced anyone that I was incapacitated, she could sell my house, drain my accounts, even decide where I'd live or die. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own child. That night, I couldn't eat. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the muted television, and thought of how many times I'd scolded her for lying as a child, how she used to cry and promise she'd never do it again. I wondered if there was something in the way I raised her, some flaw in me that had taught her deception as survival. Perhaps all of this was my doing, but regret changes nothing. It only feeds despair. Around midnight, I made a decision. I picked up the phone and called the hospital, asking to speak to Nurse Lydia. When she answered, her voice was tired but warm. "Mr. Keene," she said, "I'm glad you called. Are you all right?" I told her about the withdrawals, the forged papers, the letter on my door. She listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "You need to protect yourself. I can give you a copy of that recording. What she said after your surgery, it's enough to prove intent." The next morning I met her in the hospital cafeteria. She wasn't supposed to be on shift, but she came anyway, carrying a manila envelope. She looked younger in daylight, her hair pulled back, her eyes earnest but cautious. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said, sliding the envelope across the table, "but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." Inside was a small USB drive and a printed transcript. The transcript began with the timestamp. Post-op recovery room, August 14, 3:47 p.m. Then the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Why is he still alive? I told you DNR." I read it 3 times before I looked up. "This is my daughter's voice?" I asked, though I already knew. Lydia nodded. "You can have it verified, but yes, I was there." I thanked her, though the words felt empty against the weight of what she had given me. She touched my hand lightly. "Be careful, Mr. Keene. She's not acting like someone who just made a mistake. She seemed determined." I nodded. Determined was one word for it. Ruthless was another. On the way home, I stopped at the office of a lawyer named Carl Jennings, a man who had helped me draft Margaret's will years ago. He looked startled to see me, thinner, paler than before. I told him everything, every detail from the hospital to the bank. He listened in silence, tapping his pen against a yellow notepad. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Mr. Keene, what your daughter's done could constitute elder financial abuse and medical fraud. But you'll need hard evidence, paperwork, witnesses, and that recording. Do you have a copy of your original medical directive?" I handed him the folder. He scanned it and nodded. "Good. That gives us leverage. But you must act fast. If she's already transferring assets, she could claim you're incompetent and file for conservatorship before you even respond." The word incompetent cut through me like acid. You think she'd go that far? I asked. I've seen worse, he said grimly. People lose their parents to greed more often than you'd believe. He drafted a temporary revocation of the power of attorney and filed it that same afternoon. Watching him stamp the document gave me a small sense of relief, like putting up the first wall of defense in a siege that had already begun. He promised to send copies to the bank and the hospital. If she contacts you, he said, don't argue. Just document everything. Every word, every letter. When I returned home, the sun was setting, painting the living room in the same amber light that Margaret used to love. I sat in her armchair and tried to remember the sound of her laugh. I wish she were there to tell me what to do, to remind me that decency still meant something. But she wasn't. It was just me, a broken old man with a scar on his stomach and a daughter who wanted him gone. The phone rang around 8. I hesitated before picking it up. It was Marion. Her voice was sweet, almost playful. Dad, I heard you're home. How are you feeling? I didn't answer right away. She filled the silence with a nervous laugh. I know things got confusing at the hospital. They asked about your directives, and I just tried to help. By telling them not to revive me? I asked quietly. There was a pause so long I thought the line had died. Then softly, you were suffering. I thought it was what you'd want. Don't lie to me, I said. I saw the forms. I saw the withdrawals. Her tone changed instantly from honey to steel. You shouldn't be handling those things in your condition. You're not well enough, Dad. You're confused. I almost laughed at the audacity. If I'm so confused, how did I survive your instructions? Silence again. Then in a whisper that was half warning, half threat, she said, Don't make this ugly. I'm trying to protect you from yourself. Protect me? I said. You tried to bury me. She exhaled sharply. You don't understand what's at stake. Just rest, all right? I'll stop by tomorrow and we'll talk. But she didn't come tomorrow or the day after. What came instead were letters, official-looking envelopes from the bank, from the insurance company, from some financial advisory service I'd never heard of. All of them referencing account management updates authorized by your representative. Every one of those letters was another nail in the coffin of trust that had once bound me to her. I gathered them in a neat stack and placed them next to the transcript of her words. The evidence of betrayal was growing, tangible now, no longer confined to doubt. Yet what unsettled me most wasn't the theft or the fraud. It was the realization that she had convinced herself this was justified, that somewhere in her mind, killing her father had become an act of mercy. That kind of logic doesn't come from cruelty alone. It comes from years of detachment, of learning to see love as liability. And I, in my endless patience, had taught her that detachment by example. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance and rain began to drum softly on the roof, I made myself a promise. I would not be erased quietly. If my daughter wanted me gone, she would have to look me in the eye and try again. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and felt something harden inside me. Not vengeance, not yet, but the steady formation of resolve, cold and clear as a blade being forged. 2 weeks after I came home, I received a letter that changed everything. It arrived in a large white envelope stamped "Confidential," the kind of envelope that makes your hands shake before you even open it. Inside was a formal notice from the county court. Marion had filed a petition for conservatorship, claiming that I was mentally and physically incapable of managing my own affairs. The document described me as disoriented, easily manipulated, and prone to delusional thinking. It was signed by her attorney, and attached was a declaration from a doctor I'd never met, some specialist who had supposedly examined me during my hospital stay. His statement read, "Patient exhibits signs of progressive cognitive decline and emotional instability, rendering him unfit to make legal or medical decisions." My own daughter had decided to prove that I was not only frail, but insane. I read the lines again and again, my heart pounding so hard I could feel the stitches in my abdomen throb with every beat. The next morning, I went straight to Carl Jennings, my lawyer. He had just poured himself a cup of coffee when I handed him the papers. His eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "She's moving fast," he muttered. "If this goes through, she'll have full control of your estate, your finances, even your medical care. You won't be able to sign a check without her approval." I asked him what we could do, and he said, "First, we contest the petition. Then we prove you're competent. I'll schedule an independent medical evaluation by real doctors this time." He called a neurologist in town, an older man named Dr. Lanning, who agreed to see me the next afternoon. Before I left, Jennings placed his hand on my shoulder. "Gerald," he said quietly, "this is going to get ugly. She's banking on you losing your temper. Don't give her that satisfaction. Stay calm and keep everything documented. Every lie she tells will dig her hole deeper." I barely slept that night. I sat in the living room surrounded by the ghosts of my own house. Every object had a memory attached to it. The chipped teapot Margaret bought in Savannah, the crooked photograph of Marion at her college graduation, the wooden chair I'd repaired for her wedding reception. I kept wondering where it had all gone wrong, how the child I'd once carried on my shoulders had become a stranger calculating my demise. Somewhere between those memories, I must have drifted into sleep, because I woke at dawn with the sound of the front door creaking. For a moment I thought it was the wind, but then I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart jumped. I reached for my cane and forced myself up. Standing at the threshold of the kitchen was Marion, dressed immaculately as always, her hair tied back, her expression calm to the point of cruelty. "You shouldn't be up," she said, as though she still had the right to tell me what to do. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She placed her handbag on the counter and began opening drawers as if she owned the place. "You forgot to pay the property insurance," she said. "I'm fixing it." I laughed bitterly. "Fixing it? You forged my signature. You stole my money." She didn't even look up. "You're confused again. You've been through a lot. I know you think I'm the enemy, but I'm just trying to keep things from falling apart." Her voice was so measured that for a moment it almost worked on me, like a lullaby meant to sedate. "You tried to kill me," I said louder this time. "You told them not to resuscitate me." She froze for half a second before recovering her composure. "That's not true. You were suffering. The doctor said you might not make it. I didn't want you to—" "Die?" I interrupted. "You didn't want me to live. There's a difference." Her lips tightened. "You're twisting everything. You don't understand how hard this is for me." I felt a laugh rise in my throat, sharp and hollow. "Hard for you?" I said. "You stand over my hospital bed and ask why I'm still alive, and now you want sympathy?" Her eyes widened for a split second. She knew I had the recording. "Who told you that?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling for the first time. "Someone who still remembers what decency looks like," I said. "Her name's Lydia. She heard every word." Marion's composure cracked then, her face twisting into something I'd never seen before, a mix of fury and fear. "You have no idea what you're doing," she hissed. "You think anyone will believe an old man and some nurse breaking confidentiality?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her, long enough for her to see that I wasn't afraid anymore. She grabbed her bag and turned toward the door. "You're forcing me into a corner, Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want it to be like this." When she left, the silence felt radioactive, vibrating with what had just been revealed. I knew she wouldn't stop. She would double down. People like her always do when cornered. I called Jennings immediately and told him what had happened. "That's good," he said. "She came to your house. That proves intent to interfere. I'll send an investigator to record a statement." True to his word, that afternoon a retired detective named Wallace came by with a small tape recorder. He looked like the kind of man who could smell lies. I told him everything: her visit, her words, the recording from Lydia. He nodded and took meticulous notes. "She's digging her own grave," he said. "Once we have that tape authenticated, no judge will buy her story." The next day I went to Dr. Lanning's office for my evaluation. He was in his 70s himself, with steady hands and a dry wit. He asked me questions for over an hour about dates, history, current events, my medical background, my finances. I answered every one. Then he handed me a piece of paper and asked me to draw a clock. I drew it perfectly, labeling every number. He smiled faintly. "You're sharper than half my colleagues," he said. "I'll make sure that goes into my report." When I left his office, the sun was high, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the faint, almost forgotten sensation of dignity returning. I wasn't a helpless old man. I was a man under siege who still had enough fight left in him to defend his name. 3 days later, Jennings called. "Gerald," he said, "the neurologist's report is excellent. It confirms full cognitive function. We'll file it with the court tomorrow. But be prepared. She'll retaliate. She won't accept defeat quietly." He was right. The following morning, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. 2 men in suits got out, carrying clipboards. They said they were from Adult Protective Services and that they'd received a complaint about self-neglect and unsafe living conditions. I invited them in. They took photographs of my kitchen, checked the pantry, asked about medications, even looked inside the refrigerator. One of them, a young man with too much cologne, asked if I ever got confused about what day it was. I smiled and said, "No, but I sometimes get confused about why grown men believe everything they're told." When they left, I called Jennings again. He sighed. "She's trying to build a record. It's a common tactic. Don't let it shake you." But it did, not because I feared losing the case, but because I could see how easily truth can be buried under paperwork when the person signing it carries your blood. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window. The street was quiet, except for the low hum of cicadas. Across the yard, I saw a car parked with its lights off. A silhouette moved inside, faintly illuminated by the glow of a phone screen. I watched for several minutes until the figure finally started the engine and drove away. Whether it was paranoia or proof, I didn't know. But I locked every door in the house after that. Old age teaches you to listen to your instincts. They're all you have when everyone else calls you crazy. The next morning, Lydia called. Her voice was trembling. "Mr. Keene, someone came to the hospital asking about me. Said they were from a legal office. Wanted details about your surgery. I didn't tell them anything, but it scared me." "Did they give a name?" I asked. "No, but I recognized the description. Your daughter's husband. Tall, gray suit, polite, but pushy." My grip on the phone tightened. "She's trying to silence you," I said. "If she contacts you again, call the police." Lydia hesitated. "I'm not afraid of her," she said quietly. "You saved my future once, Mr. Keene. When I was your student, you wrote that letter that got me into college. You probably don't remember, but I do. I owe you this much." When the line went dead, I sat there for a long time, realizing that decency, though fragile, still survived in small pockets of the world. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week. Jennings prepared every document, every affidavit, every piece of evidence, but the night before the hearing, someone slipped an envelope under my front door. Inside was a photograph, me standing at the hospital entrance the day of my discharge. Written across the bottom in Marion's handwriting were the words, "Stop before you embarrass yourself." No signature, no return address, just that threat disguised as advice. I held the photo over the sink and watched the flame of a match eat through the paper until it curled into ash. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee, though my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. The world had narrowed to this: a father and a daughter locked in a quiet, civilized war, each pretending it was about love, when in truth it was about survival. The next day, I sat in the courtroom under the high ceiling fans that creaked like tired birds. Marion sat across from me, immaculate as always, flanked by her lawyer and her husband. She didn't look at me once. When my turn came, Jennings presented the evidence, the forged forms, the bank withdrawals, Lydia's transcript, the neurologist's report. Marion's lawyer objected to nearly everything, calling it irrelevant or emotionally manipulative. But when Lydia was called to testify, the room fell silent. She stood at the podium, trembling slightly, and confirmed that she had personally heard Marion say those words. "Why is he still alive?" The judge's face hardened, and for the first time Marion's mask cracked. Her lawyer tried to dismiss it as stress and miscommunication, but the damage was done. When the session ended, the judge postponed the final ruling pending verification of the recording, but he ordered a temporary suspension of Marion's control over my accounts. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a turning tide. As I left the courthouse, Marion finally looked at me. Her eyes weren't angry now. They were afraid. I didn't speak to her. I just nodded once, the way a teacher nods when a student finally realizes the cost of her own deceit. For the first time in months, the air felt breathable again. But deep inside, I knew the war wasn't over. This was only the midpoint, the fragile pause before the next storm. The silence before the final reckoning that both of us, father and daughter, now knew was inevitable. In the weeks following the hearing, I learned that victory in a courtroom means very little outside its walls. Marion vanished from sight, but her influence remained like a fog that seeps under doors no matter how tightly you seal them. The banks refused to fully restore my access until all legal matters were resolved. The hospital continued to list her as my emergency contact, and every time I tried to cancel her authorization, I ran into new forms, new procedures, new delays that seemed deliberately designed to wear me down. Jennings did what he could. He wrote letters, filed motions, called supervisors, but bureaucracy moves at the pace of indifference. I spent my mornings on hold with customer service, my afternoons signing affidavits, and my nights lying awake, wondering what she was plotting while I tried to prove that I still existed as a person and not as a case number. One afternoon, as I sat in my car outside the pharmacy waiting for my prescription, a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and Marion's husband, Richard, leaned over from the driver's seat. He was a tall man with perfect posture, his smile polished to the point of menace. "Mr. Keene," he said smoothly, "you've caused quite a commotion. Marion's worried sick about you." His voice was thick with false sympathy. I stared straight ahead. "Tell her she doesn't need to worry," I said. "I'm still alive. Somehow." He chuckled softly. Let's not turn this into a war, sir. You know she only wants what's best for you. Maybe you should let things settle down, sign a few papers, make peace." "You mean surrender," I said. His expression didn't change. "I mean be practical. The stress isn't good for your health. Marion's willing to handle everything if you just cooperate." Then he leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. "You wouldn't want another hospital incident, would you?" For a second, I thought I'd misheard him, but his eyes told me I hadn't. My throat went dry. "Is that a threat?" I asked. "No," he said pleasantly. "Just advice." He straightened his tie, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the smell of cologne and exhaust in his wake. I sat there for several minutes before realizing I was trembling. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when you finally understand that someone you loved has crossed a line they can never return from. That night, I told Jennings about the encounter. He frowned and said, "If he contacts you again, I'll file a restraining order. But for now, we focus on the financial side. The judge will review the evidence next month, and if we win, she loses everything: control, access, and credibility. That's what they're afraid of." His words should have reassured me, but they didn't. I knew Marion too well. Fear never paralyzed her. It only made her more inventive. Sure enough, within a week, new letters started arriving. Anonymous, but clearly orchestrated. One claimed that I had been seen wandering the neighborhood in a confused state. Another accused me of harassing medical staff. They were written in different handwriting, mailed from different addresses, but they all used the same phrases: mental decline, paranoid behavior, unfit for independent living. It was a smear campaign, meticulously constructed. I called the police once, but the officer who came to my door looked young enough to be my grandson and treated me with that polite skepticism reserved for senile old men. "You don't have any proof these are from your daughter, sir," he said. "Could be prank mail." When I showed him the recording transcript, he nodded sympathetically, but said, "That's between you and the courts. We can't intervene in family disputes unless there's immediate danger." I almost laughed. Immediate danger had already visited me on an operating table. Still, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible. I tended the small garden Margaret had planted behind the house, though my hands shook too much to prune the roses properly. The neighbors, kind but distant, began avoiding long conversations. They must have heard the rumors, or maybe Marion had reached them too. I could feel the slow social isolation creeping in, the way people start to treat you like a ghost before you're even dead. Sometimes I thought about leaving, selling the house, and moving to some quiet retirement community where no one knew me, but that would mean letting her win. This house wasn't just property. It was memory made solid. It was where I'd built a life, and I would not abandon it because my daughter had forgotten what love was supposed to mean. Then came the call from Lydia. Her voice was strained, almost whispering. "Mr. Keene," she said, "I think something's wrong at the hospital. Someone accessed the patient files. I got a notice that your chart was reviewed by an unauthorized account. I checked. It was traced to a terminal registered to your daughter's company." I felt a surge of cold fury. "She's still trying to rewrite the records," I said. "Why?" Lydia hesitated. "Because if she can prove you were declared incompetent by a doctor before the surgery, she can claim she acted in good faith with the DNR order. That would clear her legally." I gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. "Can we prove she tampered with the files?" "I'm working on it," she said. "But if they find out I'm looking, I could lose my job." I told her to be careful, but she only said, "You saved me once. Let me return the favor. When the line went dead, I realized that Lydia was now part of this war too. A bystander pulled into the undertow of my family's decay. A few days later, Jennings called with news that almost broke me. "Gerald," he said carefully, "I just got notice from the bank's legal department. Your daughter filed a new claim of joint ownership on the property. She used your medical records as evidence of diminished capacity. They've put a temporary hold on any transactions involving your home. You can't sell it, refinance it, or change the title until the case is resolved." I felt the room spin around me. "She's taking my house?" I asked, my voice cracking. "She's trying to," he said. "But don't panic. Once we prove her records are falsified, it'll backfire. For now, keep everything locked up and don't sign a single paper, no matter who sends it." That evening I received a voicemail from Marion. Her tone was strangely calm, almost gentle, the way people talk to patients in nursing homes. "Dad," she said, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. I know you think I've betrayed you, but you're not well. Everyone sees it but you. Let me take care of things. You'll be safe, I promise. You can stay in the guest house for as long as you want. We'll make sure you're comfortable." I listened to that message 3 times. It was the same manipulative cadence she used as a teenager when she wanted to skip curfew or borrow money. Soft, measured, rehearsed. I deleted it and sat there in the dark, wondering how someone could speak of love in the same breath as theft. Days turned into a slow, grinding blur. I began to keep a written journal of every event, every call, every letter. It wasn't just for the case. It was a survival mechanism. When the world starts to doubt your sanity, you need evidence of your own coherence. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up to faint sounds outside. The crunch of gravel, a car engine idling down the block, a flicker of light across the curtains. Once I found a small drone hovering outside my window, its red light blinking. I waved my cane at it until it flew away. Whether it belonged to Marion or my own imagination, I couldn't tell anymore. But paranoia doesn't mean they're not actually watching. Lydia called again 2 weeks later, her voice trembling. "I found it," she said. "There's a digital alteration log on your file. Timestamps from your daughter's login. She changed your medical directive date to make it look like you signed a DNR years ago. I've printed everything, but I can't send it electronically. It has to be physical proof." I met her that evening at a small diner outside town. She handed me an envelope thicker than the last one. Inside were printouts of hospital logs, access records, and screenshots showing Marion's name. "This is enough to ruin her," Lydia said quietly. "But you have to be careful how you use it. If she finds out I helped you, I'll lose my license." I promised her I would protect her. She smiled faintly. "You already have." The next morning I took the envelope to Jennings. When he saw the documents, he whistled softly. "This is gold," he said. "Tampering with medical records is a felony. If we present this, the judge will not only deny her conservatorship, he'll open a criminal investigation." He leaned back, looking at me with a mix of respect and pity. "Gerald, I've seen families tear each other apart over money, but this is something else. Are you sure you want to go through with it? It'll destroy her." I thought about Margaret, about the letter she'd written before she died. "Don't let anyone decide for you how to leave this world." Then I thought about the hospital table, the voice asking why I was still alive. "She destroyed herself," I said quietly. "I'm just making sure the truth is seen." The court date was set for the end of the month. In the days leading up to it, Marion made one last attempt to reach me. She showed up unannounced, standing on my porch in a tailored suit. Her face pale, her eyes bloodshot. For the first time she looked like the child I remembered. Lost, exhausted, fragile beneath the armor. "Dad," she said, "can we talk? Please." Against my better judgment, I opened the door. She stepped inside, glancing around the house as if memorizing it for the last time. "You're going to ruin everything," she said. "Do you understand that? My career, my reputation, everything I've built." I looked at her and said, "You did that yourself." She shook her head violently. "I was trying to help you. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought—" She stopped, biting her lip. "Thought what?" I asked. "That if you died, it would be easier." Her silence was the answer. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. "You don't know what it's like," she said finally. "To watch you fade, to think every day might be the one where you don't wake up. I couldn't handle it. I didn't want to see you turn into someone else." "So you decided to skip that part," I said. "To end it before it was inconvenient." She looked up, her eyes glistening with tears that might have been genuine. "I was scared," she said. "And yes, maybe I thought about the inheritance. But that wasn't the reason, not really. I just wanted it over. For both of us. I should have felt pity. But what I felt instead was something closer to mourning, not for myself, but for the daughter I'd lost long before this day. "Marion," I said, "you've mistaken control for love your whole life. You can't fix death. You can't manage it like a spreadsheet. It comes when it comes. And when it does, the only thing that matters is whether you stood beside someone or turned away." She wiped her eyes and whispered, "I stood beside you my whole life. You just never saw me." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'll see you in court." After she left, I sat there for a long time, listening to the echo of the closing door. The air in the house felt different now, heavier, as if her presence had left a residue of grief behind. I realized that no matter what happened in court, something irreversible had already occurred. The line between parent and child had been severed, not by money or documents, but by that moment in the hospital when she'd chosen her convenience over my breath. The night before the hearing, I opened Margaret's old letter again. The paper was fragile now, the ink faded, but the words still clear. When people lose their way, don't chase them. Just live long enough to show them they were wrong. I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something quieter, sharper, a sense of finality. I wasn't fighting her anymore. I was simply standing where truth had placed me, waiting for her to face what she had become. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and airless, the kind of Florida morning when even the clouds seemed to hold their breath, heavy with anticipation. I woke before sunrise, shaved slowly, dressed in my best suit, the one Margaret had insisted I keep for important occasions. The irony of wearing it to face my daughter in court wasn't lost on me. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. Pale, thinner than I remembered, the lines around my mouth cut deep from months of strain. But my eyes, at least, were clear. For the first time in years, they carried purpose. I tucked Margaret's letter into my breast pocket, folded neatly, and slipped the small USB drive with the hospital logs into my briefcase. It felt like carrying two versions of the same truth, one made of love, the other of evidence. When I arrived, the courthouse steps glistened from a light drizzle that had passed through earlier, leaving the air smelling faintly of wet stone and cut grass. Jennings was already waiting by the entrance, leaning on his cane, his tie slightly crooked. "You ready for this, Gerald?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day she told them not to bring me back," I said. He nodded, and we went inside. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered. wooden benches polished by decades of use, a few fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Marion was already seated at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer and her husband. She didn't look at me, but I noticed the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her papers. That small human weakness, fear disguised as composure, gave me strength. The proceedings began quietly. Marion's lawyer rose first, painting a portrait of me as a man in decline, overwhelmed by paranoia, manipulated by outside influences. He used words like disorientation, hallucinations, emotional instability. Each one landed like a stone against my chest, not because I believed them, but because they came from my own flesh and blood. When he finished, Jennings stood, calm and deliberate, and began dismantling the argument one thread at a time. He produced the neurologist's report confirming my full competence, the bank's acknowledgement of forged documents, the letters from Adult Protective Services dismissing her anonymous claims. Then finally, he held up the envelope Lydia had risked everything to deliver. "Your Honor," he said, "we also have evidence that the petitioner deliberately tampered with hospital records in an attempt to falsify her father's medical history and justify an illegal do not resuscitate order." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marion's lawyer objected immediately, but the judge, an older woman with a calm, impenetrable expression, raised a hand. "Overruled," she said. "Continue." Jennings inserted the USB drive into the court's display monitor, and the screen flickered to life. The digital logs appeared first, access timestamps, login IDs, IP addresses, and there, in stark black letters, was Marion's name. Then came the audio file. The room fell silent except for the faint crackle of the recording. Marion's voice filled the air. "Why is he still alive? I told you, DNR." For a few seconds after it ended, no one spoke. The sound seemed to linger even after the speakers went quiet, as if the words themselves refused to leave the room. Marion's face went pale, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting toward her lawyer, who looked as if he wished he could vanish. The judge adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Ms. Hollis," she said, her voice steady but cold, "do you deny that this is your voice?" Marion opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Finally, she whispered, "I was under stress. I didn't mean." "Answer the question," the judge interrupted. "Is it your voice?" Marion hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that swallows everything else. The scraping of pens, the shuffling of papers, even the sound of breathing. It wasn't triumph I felt then. It was something closer to grief. I had waited months for justice, but when it finally arrived, it felt less like victory and more like witnessing a slow, necessary death, not of a person, but of a bond. The judge leaned back in her chair and spoke quietly, almost gently. "Ms. Hollis, the evidence presented here is grave. You knowingly falsified legal and medical documents, attempted to defraud your father of his property, and misrepresented his wishes during a medical emergency. This court finds in favor of Mr. Keene. Your petition for conservatorship is denied, and an immediate investigation will be referred to the state attorney's office." I watched as Marion's composure cracked completely. She tried to speak, but her voice broke into sobs that echoed through the courtroom. Her husband reached out to touch her shoulder, but she pulled away from him, covering her face with her hands. I should have felt vindicated, but instead, I felt an aching sorrow that reached deeper than anger ever could. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Keene," she said, "I am deeply sorry for what you've endured. You are free to pursue any civil or criminal action you deem appropriate." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. After the session ended, Reporters waiting in the hallway began to swarm, but Jennings guided me past them. "Let's get you out of here," he said. As we stepped into the sunlight, the drizzle had stopped, and the sky was clearing, pale blue breaking through gray. It should have felt like release, but I carried the weight of something unresolved. Marion stood by the courthouse steps, alone now, her husband speaking hurriedly to their lawyer a few feet away. She looked at me for the first time since the trial began. Her eyes were swollen, her expression unreadable, part remorse, part defiance. I walked toward her slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I stopped in front of her, she whispered, "Are you happy now?" I shook my head. "No, Marion, there's no happiness in this. Only truth." She looked down, her voice trembling. "You've ruined me." "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. I just stopped pretending it hadn't happened." She took a step closer, her face twisting with something between desperation and fury. "I was scared," she said again, repeating the same words she'd used in my kitchen. "You don't know what fear does to people." "Fear doesn't make people forge signatures or lie under oath," I said. "It doesn't make them tell strangers to let their father die." She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Not loud, heaving sobs, but the quiet kind, the kind that seems to come from somewhere deep and unfixable. For a moment, I almost reached out to comfort her, to rest a hand on her shoulder as I had when she was a child. But something inside me stopped. I realized that forgiveness, at least in this moment, would be another form of indulgence, and I had spent my entire life indulging her. Instead, I said quietly, "I hope one day you remember the part of yourself that still knows how to love without conditions." Then I turned and walked away. Outside, the air had changed, lighter, cooler, as if the storm that had been building for months had finally broken. Jennings caught up with me by the car and opened the door. "You did the right thing," he said. I looked at him and asked, "Then why does it feel like I buried someone?" He sighed. "Because you did, just not in the way you expected." That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of the silence. It was mine again. I thought of Lydia, who had risked everything for me, and decided to call her the next morning to thank her properly. I thought of Margaret and how she would have handled all of this, not with anger, but with that calm clarity she always carried, the kind that comes from knowing right from wrong without needing to shout it. I reached into my pocket and unfolded her letter once more. The words seemed to speak directly to this moment. "When you stand for truth, even those who love you may hate you for it. Stand anyway." In the distance, I could hear the faint chirping of crickets and the low hum of the streetlights flickering to life. For the first time since the surgery, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the air fill my lungs without fear that someone might decide I didn't deserve another breath. I had survived my daughter's mercy. I had survived her love turned poisonous. And now, standing in the quiet evening light, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph, but the steady, enduring peace of a man who has faced death twice and chosen life both times. When I finally went inside, I stopped by the hallway where Margaret's portrait hung. Her eyes, captured in the soft haze of old film, seemed to follow me. "It's done," I whispered. "You were right." The house creaked softly as if in response. I turned off the lights and went to bed, knowing that when morning came, I would wake not as a victim or a survivor, but simply as myself again, a man who had been tested by blood and betrayal and had chosen, against every instinct of pride and pain, to live on. The weeks after the verdict passed like a long exhale after holding one's breath for too many months. The calls from lawyers stopped. The envelopes with thick legal seals stopped arriving. And for the first time in a year, my mailbox was filled with ordinary things again. A grocery flyer, a church bulletin, a postcard from a former student now teaching in Oregon. Silence, once terrifying, had become a kind of luxury. I moved more slowly now, not because of age, but because I wanted to. I cooked small meals, cleaned out drawers Margaret had once kept neatly arranged, and found traces of a life that had been waiting patiently for me to return to it. Grief, I discovered, doesn't vanish when justice is done. It only changes its temperature. What used to burn now cooled into something bearable, something that could sit beside me at the table without demanding attention. Marion didn't contact me for nearly 2 months. I learned through Jennings that the district attorney was still reviewing the case for possible charges, but that she had resigned from her firm before they could decide. Her husband left her soon after. I tried to imagine what her days looked like now, maybe sitting in some rented apartment surrounded by boxes, watching the walls close in, convincing herself that she was the victim. There was a time when that thought would have pleased me, but it didn't. It only made me tired. Vengeance, when it finally loses its flavor, leaves only the taste of dust. I spent more time outside as autumn crept in. The garden Margaret planted came back to life in ways I hadn't expected. The roses bloomed again, fewer but brighter, and a stray cat, not the same one as before, but similar enough, began appearing each morning for food. I named him Oliver. Feeding him became a ritual that stitched my mornings together. Sometimes I'd speak to him softly, telling him things I couldn't tell another person, like how I missed the sound of Margaret's laughter, or how I still reached for the phone when something reminded me of Marion, before remembering that she was now a ghost of the living kind. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch reading, a car pulled into the driveway. A young man stepped out, tall, neatly dressed, holding a small envelope. It took me a moment to recognize him. Thomas, my grandson. I hadn't seen him in years, not since Margaret's funeral. He hesitated before walking closer, as if unsure whether he'd be welcome. "Grandpa," he said quietly. The word sounded fragile, like something unused for too long. I stood, my cane trembling slightly in my hand, and nodded. "You look taller," I said. He smiled faintly. "People say that happens." We sat together on the porch, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, he handed me the envelope. "Mom asked me to give you this," he said. "She didn't want to come herself." I took it slowly, half expecting another attempt at manipulation. But the handwriting on the front was shaky, uncertain. Inside was a short letter. "Dad, I don't know what I'm supposed to say that would matter. I can't defend what I did, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you believe that some part of me loved you, even when I was trying to erase you. I've started therapy. They say that guilt is a form of love turned backward. Maybe they're right. I hope you're safe. Marion." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside me. Thomas watched me quietly. "She's not the same," he said softly. "She's trying," I nodded. "People spend their whole lives trying. Sometimes that's all they can do." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you hate her?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No. Hate takes energy, and I don't have any left for that. I just can't trust her again. That's different." He nodded, his eyes downcast. Before he left, he said, "Mom wanted me to tell you she's sorry she didn't let you die." She said it like a confession. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw in his face the faint outline of the girl she once was. Curious, bright, full of questions. "Tell her," I said slowly, "that I'm not sorry I lived." After he drove away, I sat for a long time in the fading sunlight, listening to the crickets start their evening song. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and wet soil. I realized that for the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. Survival, I learned, isn't only about defying death. Sometimes it's about enduring what comes after. The quiet rebuilding of a life that nearly ended by someone else's choice. I wrote a new will that night. It was simple. The house and savings would go to Thomas, and a portion of the remainder to a local scholarship fund in Margaret's name. I didn't leave Marion out of cruelty. I left her out because inheritance, like forgiveness, must be earned. Days passed into weeks, and winter crept in gently. I began attending Sunday services again, sitting in the back pew, content to listen rather than pray. People nodded to me now, some even smiled. The rumor mill had quieted, and I was just another old man again, frail but intact, a fixture of the town who had somehow survived scandal and betrayal without losing his manners. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes during the hymns, I could almost feel Margaret beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. That feeling, fleeting, tender, undeserved, was enough. On the first day of the new year, I stood on the porch watching the sunrise. The sky burned gold and pale pink over the rooftops, and the cold air bit gently at my skin. I thought of the hospital, the sound of machines keeping me alive, and the question that had haunted me for months. Why is he still alive? The answer had changed. I was still alive because someone, a nurse, a stranger, had decided that my life still mattered when my own daughter didn't. I was alive because truth, fragile as it is, sometimes finds its way through the cracks. And I was alive because perhaps Margaret had been right. The only real victory over cruelty is to keep living with your heart still open. I whispered a quiet thank you to the morning, to the house that had sheltered my storms, to the memory of the woman who had taught me decency, and even to the daughter who had taught me the price of love when it curdles into control. Then I went inside, fed Oliver, and made 2 cups of coffee. One for me, one for Margaret, out of habit more than faith. As the steam rose from the cups and sunlight filled the kitchen, I realized that peace doesn't announce itself with trumpets or angels. It comes quietly, like dawn, slow, hesitant, but certain. And when it finally arrived, I did what I'd promised myself I would do all along. I lived.